Excellent. Hey, we were just listening to the wind for those who are wondering what I'm doing. Again, if you have prayer concerns, please let me know. I know someone tried to reach out to me a little bit ago, but there was no message. So on Mondays, just let me know, hopefully by 4, and I will gladly share those with the group here. As I say that, in our group that are here tonight, we have prayers for Belinda's cat. So our pets are part of our family, so prayers for our pets. And so we'll use that because God does bless us with many things that we take for granted. And pets are like family for many of us. So let us pause, just take a deep breath, and we'll start. Let's pray. Gracious God, you do bless us in so many ways with so many gifts. You give us this valley that we live in. And yes, it is windy today, but God, we look around and we realize how blessed we are with the mountains that are starting to turn green again. The flowers are blooming. The trees are budding and blooming themselves. The grass is growing. What appeared to be death is now beaming with life. The reminder that you are our source of life. So we just thank you for these subtle reminders that are all around us. We thank you for the ability to come together tonight in a place and safely worship. We thank you that things like worship and study we take for granted, but we get to come safely and study without fear of persecution. We thank you for our friends. We thank you for our church. We thank you for our pets that you've graced us with. And we just ask tonight that you especially watch over Belinda's cat. God, as we come together tonight, as we remember your son's holy, what we call Holy Week, what was his last week before the crucifixion, we just ask that you give us ears to hear, hearts that are open to grow. We pray this through your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. I'm going to try, if you see me looking at the clock more than usual, it's because I have a meeting tonight, and I'll try to focus on you, not the clock. I'm going to try to do both. Since you fed me, I should hopefully focus better. So we're in chapter 20, and we're going to read verses 1 through 8 before we start. Just a quick reminder, last week, we were Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Jesus cleared the money changers out, and that's where I want you to remember Jesus clearing the money changers and all the animals out. So we'll pick up chapter 20, verses 1 through 8. One day, as he was teaching the people in the temple courts and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us by what authority you're doing these things," they said. "Who gave you this authority?" He replied, "I will ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men?" They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered, "We don't know where it was from." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things." So we've seen this growing controversy throughout Luke's gospel, controversy that Jesus has had with the religious leaders. And especially as he's entered into Jerusalem, they asked him to keep the crowd quiet. And of course, he upset them because we read that when he threw out the money changers and the animals, he upset the religious leaders as well. So now we come to this question of authority. We have the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. The Sanhedrin, they have been the one that's been granted authority over the temple. They've been granted authority over religion. They have the freedom of religion that's been given to them by the Roman government, as long as they can maintain order. But Jesus has now come. And as far as they're concerned, Jesus is questioning or challenging that authority because he ran out the money changers. He ran out the merchants. So we're coming to a time where they want to question Jesus. And they're not really caring why Jesus was acting, but they're hoping that Jesus is going to say, something that's going to incriminate him. They're hoping he's going to stumble on something. In today's world, if a politician says something, the press has a field day and runs with it forever. They're hoping Jesus is going to say something that will incriminate him. So we come here, and in mine, and we're reading Luke, it says one day, here, one day. Mark, because you've done Mark with me, most of us, Mark says it happened the same day that Jesus ran out the money changers. Matthew says it's the day after. So you're going to say, Jeff, which is it? Don't know. I'll just be honest. I stick with Luke. Luke says one day. It could be the same. It could be the day after. We're going to say one day about this. Soon after Jesus cleared the temple, Jesus returns to the temple. Because this one day he was teaching in the temple. We can assume he's still there. Jesus in the temple. While he's there, we got three groups that make up the Sanhedrin: chief priests, teachers, teachers of the law / scribes, and the elders. And they had met Jesus after he had driven out the money changers and the sellers, but they weren't able to decide what to do at that time, as we read last week. So now they're coming, and they're hoping that Jesus is going to say something that damages himself. So they ask him the question, by what authority had he done the things that he has done? I mean, this is an insinuation that Jesus had really not come to them because they're the one that has authority over the temple. So the insinuation is, which one of us did you ask? Which one of us did you ask? By what authority had you come? Because we're the ones in charge with religious affairs. So technically, it's a legitimate question. It would be like, no, not being funny. If someone came on to use the building, or I walked in here tonight and there's a group I wasn't expecting, I would say, well, who gave you this? Was it Andrew? Or was it the trustees? I know I didn't, because I didn't expect you here. So technically it is a legitimate question. But again, we got to realize, because we know the backstory, they don't really recognize who Jesus or realize who Jesus is. Because we know who Jesus is. We know Jesus, Son of God. But either way, they're hoping to track him. If Jesus had acted without proper authority, it would discredit him before the people, If Jesus claimed he had acted on the authority of God doing the things that he had done, they would have said he was speaking blasphemy, which would have meant death. Even though we know who would have been telling the truth, they would have seen it as blasphemy, which would have been death. If he said, well, neither of those, I acted on my own authority, which would mean no authority, then they would just say he's some fanatic. Some fanatic. And they would hope that the crowd would come to see that, this guy's not working. He's on his own. He's some fanatic. So we come to verse 2, and they say, tell us by what authority you're doing these things. Who gave you this authority? And what do we read? And Jesus says, I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or was it from men? Jesus doesn't answer their question at first. We're going to see that he does indirectly later. But he doesn't answer the question at first. He's using what would have been a common debate technique among rabbis at the time. It would be a common debate between also scribes, philosophers. He counters their question with another question. And by asking this, or by answering this way, he's hoping it'll help those around arrive to the truth of their actions. Because Jesus knew the religious leaders really didn't want to know by what authority was Jesus acting. Jesus knew that they wanted to trap him. But he also knew that their answer about John, would reveal their attitude towards him as well. Because Jesus was saying and implying that the source of his authority was the same as John the Baptist. Now, for us, we know this because we've done 20 chapters with Jeff so far in Luke. We know, because we read chapter 1 and 2, we know, God called John. We know God had been at work through Jesus. So we know God was at work in both births. We read the first 2 chapters. But Jesus here in this moment, he's exposing the leaders' inconsistencies. So we see them, they're talking, and they discussed among themselves. He said, if we say it's from heaven, he's going to ask, well, why didn't you believe him? If John's authority came from heaven, why didn't you believe him? Because remember what John said, here's the Messiah. Then they would know, oh, Jesus. So if we say, then why didn't you believe John? But if we say he's from men, all the people will stone us because they thought John was a prophet. If they agreed that John's authority was divine, then they had to agree that Jesus was the Messiah because John said so. But if they denied John's authority, then the people would rise up against him. They believed that possibly they could get stoned to death on the spot. So what do? They say nothing. Well, they didn't say nothing. Actually, here it says, we don't know. We don't know where it's from. Why? Because they just really didn't want to answer the question. So since they refused to answer the question, Jesus says, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. Jesus said, if they're going to remain silent, then I will refuse to answer my question as well. And the Pharisees knew his answer. They knew that Jesus believed that his authority was the same as John's. They knew that. But they knew they also couldn't push the issue any further. So basically what we see they do is they hit the pause button. And Jesus, as we see, Jesus uses it as a teaching moment. We're going to go into that. But I love this because I think sometimes silence speaks volumes. I know that's not in most commentaries, but sometimes you can say a lot by not saying anything. Like if somebody says something that's just really out of line, sometimes just by not saying things, because we usually want to give an answer, but sometimes just by not saying anything, you could get more power out of that. I remember as I say that right now, this is not my notes, but my brain just went there. When I first came back to my home church as an associate pastor, I loved it because I wasn't the pastor anymore, or the head pastor, because I didn't have to make all the decisions. So I could come late to meetings, and it'd be George's responsibility. I didn't have to worry. But often I would just sit there, let him run the meetings. I didn't have to run the meetings anymore. And then one day, I forget what it was. It was just something that was just way out of line. And I said something. I spoke. It's like, and George pulled me aside later. He said, you don't know how much power you had in that moment, because he said, you've been quiet all those times, but now you finally spoke. It's like you had their attention in that moment. He said, don't ever abuse that gift. So I just thought that sometimes silence speaks volume. So I say this so we can think, because usually we want to just respond. And in today's world, we have to respond with first thing we see. I have people come to me all the time. I'm mad at my family member. Why are you mad at my family member? Because I saw them post something on Facebook and I had to respond. I'm thinking, you didn't have to respond. You really didn't have to. You could have ignored. You could have blocked it. You could have unfriended them, unfollowed them. But we feel like we have to respond. So Jesus does respond, though. He's silent there to their question, but he uses it as a teaching moment. And so we have this long parable here, the parable of the tenants, or if I put the parable of the wicked tenants. So Jesus went on to tell the people, assume everybody's still there. You got crowd around, disciples there, religious leaders. He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, what shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. This is the heir, they said. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And when the people heard this, they said, daggone it. No, they said, well, may this never be. And Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is written? What is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. The teachers of the law, the chief priests, looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. So, if we're paying attention, according to Luke, Jesus told the parable, as it says here, to the people we read in verse 9. But we know, as the scribes and Pharisees and elders come to see, while he's talking to the people, apparently it's against the scribes, the chief priests, and the elders, who, as we saw in verse 19, who are apparently listening as Jesus teaches this parable. Now, some are going to say this is only part of the true parable is taught. Some will say that this parable is much longer. Others are going to say either way, especially since Luke wrote it to a Gentile readership, that this would reflect what the early church came to believe theologically. That the Jews rejected not only God but Jesus, but God had chosen to work through the Gentiles, the non-Jews. So how this message would go beyond to the Gentiles. So anyway, let's just stick to the parable itself. So before the beginning, it says the owner of the vineyard. Excuse me. Before we begin, let's think of this. Let's make sure we know the characters. If I were doing a play, let's just say it's the cast. The owner of the vineyard is God. So the owner of the vineyard is God. The vineyard itself, Israel. The tenants, well, as we see, they're the religious leaders of Jerusalem. The servants are the prophets of the Old Testament. And the son, well, that's the no-brainer. That was Jesus. At least I'm hoping we'll get that. The son is Jesus. And the others, where it says it gets to the others, as I said, Luke's right to this would be to the Gentiles. So, after Jesus had challenged their authority and they come and ask, by whose authority do you do this? And they get into the debate, no answers given. Jesus turns to the people and he answers their question through a parable. And he shows by what authority he did what he did, as well as exposes their plan to kill him. Now, this idea of a vineyard, comparing a nation to a vineyard, that might seem strange to us. And that's because we haven't really gotten to spend much time in the Old Testament yet. And at the rate I'm going, that would be like 2030 before we ever touch on it. No, it wouldn't be that bad. Because we only got John after this. No, we didn't do John's letters yet, did we? Oh, my. 2026 maybe? So, but I gave you some passages. I gave you 4 examples. There's lots of examples in the Old Testament where you see the nation of Israel as a vineyard. And I just want to look at one of them. I know I gave you the Psalm, and it's usually what I go to first. But I was looking again today. Let's just go to the one in Isaiah chapter 5. Or you can just hang here and I'll come right back to you. How's that? And while you're turning, while you guys stay online, Jeff, so he doesn't pass out. Yeah.
No passing out.
No, it's getting like it. Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 7. He says, I will sing the one I love, a song about his vineyard. His vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared off its stones, planted it with the choicest of vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for the crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. So you get this image of something beautiful being set up, but then there's disappointment. It's like, Robbie, you still grow grapes? Okay. It's like you do all this work and instead you just have, So that's what's happened. And now he says, you dwellers in Jerusalem and Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? And we could keep on going, but it's the image of how the people were like bad fruit. They were to be something beautiful, a healthy vineyard. So the image of the vineyard here represents the people of Israel, people of Judah. And so we have the image of vineyard here in Luke, and it's a picture of one we've got that that cares of a vineyard. A man planted a vineyard, like we read in Isaiah. He rented it to others when he went away for a long time. Now, this idea of leasing the land, it was a common practice of the time. It's a business practice at the time. The absentee owner would hire tenant farmers, and they would come, they would work the land, and take care of the fields and the crops. And how they paid rent is they would give a portion of back to the landowner when it came harvest time. So it worked out good. They had a place to live. They got to keep sometimes a half of the crop, but they had to return half rightfully to the owner. And as I say, when you go back to Jewish history or history in Middle Eastern culture, this idea of tension between the landowners and the tenants, it was real. I mean, heck, it's still, if you know friends that own rental property, there's still tension at times between landowners and tenants. But it's harvest time. And it's harvest time. At great picking time, the absentee landowner, he would send one of his servants. And that's what we see here. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vine. But the tenants beat him, sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another. What happens? They beat him and treated him shamefully. He sent another one empty-handed. They sent a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. It's harvest time. And the great picking time, the absentee landowner sends one of his servants to collect what's rightfully his, a share of the crop. And the share could be, like I said, anywhere from a quarter to half of the crop. And it would usually not be, when I say crop, let's be real, it wasn't just the grapes. It would usually be paid in wine. It had been processed. So they would get half that had been made into wine. And if we think about this is not just how crops were managed during first century Palestine. This is a parable. And as we said, the parable where we have those servants that are being sent, rejected servants being killed, rejected. These servants represent over the years the prophets that were sent by God time and time again to the nation of Israel. They were either ignored or mistreated, like Jeremiah, thrown into the well. Isaiah threatened by Jezebel. So in the parable, you got time and time, servant after servant, prophet after prophet. Some it says were what? Beaten. They beat him, and well, Jeremiah was beaten. Some killed. Well, Isaiah. Tradition has Isaiah killed. John the Baptist, the prophet, killed. Some stoned when we spent time in 2 Chronicles. Some of the prophets were stoned. So Jesus just reminding how the nation of Israel had responded to the prophets that God had sent. Jesus reminded religious leaders that God's prophets had often been ridiculed and persecuted by God's own people. So in verse 13, it says, Then the owner of the vineyard said, What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him. Now, the fact that the landowner had not already punished the farmers for their treatment, think about this. This shows God's great patience with us as human beings. When you read the Old Testament, I'm not halfway through it right now. I've been reading it again this year. When you think about how unfaithful the people are, the kings were, if it were a work project for me, I would have given up. Given up on them, but they didn't. God didn't give up. It shows God's patience. You see a God that's patient with people over the centuries. I mean, think about us in our own lives. God's patient, shows mercy for us. The people of Israel, of course, when you spend time in the Old Testament, they stubbornly refused to listen to the message of the prophets. The religious leaders here were not listening to John. Today, they don't listen to what we learn in Bible study or what we learn in Sunday school or in messages. But yet God's a God of grace, unrelenting in love. So the landowner again says, I'm going to do one more thing. And this is where we can stick to the Bible. I will send my son. I will send my son, whom I love. You can even hear an echo of this. Think about Jesus at the baptism. This is my son, whom I love. or the transfiguration. This is my son, whom I love. And I gave you, I think, did I put Luke 3:22 and 9:35 on your sheets? I should have. Dang. Okay, write down in there Luke 3:22 and 9:35. Because you hear echoes of here. This is my son, whom I love. You hear echoes of that at the baptism and the transfiguration. So think about this. Here, Jesus is implying where his authority came from. Remember, where did you get this story? Back in verse 2. I will send my son. I will send my son. They will listen to him. Whose authority? He's acting on the Father's authority. It's like the son of the parable. Jesus had been sent on behalf of God to act on God's authority. But like the chief priest and the elders and scribe, they debated among themselves. So the wicked tenants, they do the same thing. They debate about what should they do with the younger son. When the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. This is the heir. They said, let's kill him so the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. The question is then, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill the tenants and give the vineyard to others. So, now this might seem strange. We're still in first century. Now back to the parable itself. Under inheritance laws in the first century, the historical situation is right. So I will pick on myself. If I have the only heir I have, let's just pretend it's Jonathan. And Jonathan, I send Jonathan and they kill Jonathan. If I have no other heirs when I die, the law would be those would fall to the land. It'd be like today's adverse possession, I guess, because they were on the property. They were actually working the property. Under the law, the property would become theirs. So when the master died, with the son being killed, they could claim the property. Again, Jesus knows. He's revealing in this parable. He knows they're going to kill him. And these are church people that don't know I teach Bible study. So we won't tell you who that was. And that just took my brain off in left field. So here's Jesus. He's revealing his intent that the religious leaders are going to kill him. So what do? It says what? It says, what will the owner do? What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? The Greek word here is, we got owner. I didn't look at New Revised. Does it have owner? What will the owner do in verse 15, the second part of 15?
Yes.
Okay. The actual word, this is the cool part, at least I think it is. The Greek word is kurios, which means master. Master. Or let's just take it one step further. Guess what that can also be translated as? God or Lord. So what will God do? What will God do? Now the parables, what will the owner do? What will the owner do? But you just take this parable and go, what will God do with these religious leaders? That's the backstory that's running underneath this parable the whole time. You see, again, Jesus is giving you a hint now who the owner is. And who represents the prophets. He's now letting them know how it's played out. He's letting them know how it played out with prophets, John the Baptist, and now Jesus being rejected. And he's letting them know the religious leaders are going to be punished. He's letting them know the religious leaders will be punished. Now, when you hear about people getting punished, we'll go kill the tenants and give the vineyard to others. The people heard this and they say, this is horrible. They sensed the horror of the story, but they didn't understand. They thought it was just a parable. Now, the religious leaders understood it was about Jesus. The people thought this was just a gruesome parable. And they said, it's horrible. And they said, basically they're saying, God forbid this ever happening. But what we also see with it is truth, is that the mantleship of leadership among the religious community It was going to be passing quickly, very shortly, from the religious leaders to the leaders of the church. Because remember, it said, God looked at them and said, this is what's going to be written, because we just said it's going to give the vineyard to others. And they just couldn't fathom giving that vineyard to others. They understood at least part. The vineyard is the people, the nation of Israel. And God forbid that the nation of Israel would be given to others. But the promises, now, it was going to be now given to the church. And with it, when people said, well, God forbid, may this never be, Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. So I'm thinking about this. We spread this out over 2 weeks, and I like the idea that it all happens in a day. Because Jesus is quoting, your Bible probably has footnotes, and I probably put on your sheet, Psalm 118, verse 22. Okay, good. And Jesus shows with it how even the Messiah would be rejected. It had been prophesied. Now, again, the irony of this as well, Psalm 118, it was part of the words that would be offered during the Passover. The part of the Hallel, it's part of the praise, the festival psalms. And so they've been reciting these words for years. They, think about it, every Passover meal they've been reciting. The stone the builders rejected has become a capstone. They've recited these words for years. And now it was coming to play in that moment. I say that because, we spent earlier in the year, 6 weeks looking at the Lord's Prayer. And the reason we did is because so often I said we pray these words and we don't really think about what we're praying. They'd been saying these words for centuries and never really considered that which was going to be rejected was now taking place right before their eyes. So Jesus shows this parable how again, this image of a stone, you can do a couple of things. This image of a pot, if it falls on the stone, it's cracked, it's useless. But the flip side, you can use as a cornerstone of a building and build something great out of it. But that choice is ours. So, ideally they would build on it, which the church would do. The religious leaders, they were going to be the ones like the image of being smashed pots all over the place because they couldn't see it. And the question before them is, which would they choose? And of course, we see what happens because we know the choice of the teachers of the law, the chief priests. They look for a way to arrest Jesus. I think they'd rather remain broken. Immediately because they knew that he had spoken about them. They knew the parable was against them. They knew that they were the tenants, the ones responsible for the vineyard, cultivating the people of Israel. They knew it was against them. Yet they also realized they had no grounds to arrest Jesus. You can't arrest somebody for teaching a parable. Especially Jesus has been teaching his parable to the people. So again, it's like we read earlier. What's their fear? Fear of a riot. There's afraid that there's a riot. And if there's a riot, guess what happens? That means they've lost control. And if they lose control, Rome's going to step in and say, hey, you're not responsible for religious affairs anymore. So they realized they had to do what? They had to go find, they're afraid of the people, and they realized they got to find another way to trap Jesus. So, which we go to in the next section. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be honest. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so they might hand him over to the power and authority of the government, of the governor. So the spies questioned him, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? He saw through their duplicity and said to them, Show me denarius. Whose portrait and inscription is on it? Caesar, they replied. And he said to them, Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And again, they were unable to trap him for what he had said there in public. And astonished by his answer, they became silent. So again, you guys have done Mark and Matthew with me. Mark is truly different because in Mark we see instead of spies, we see the Pharisees and Herodians coming to question Jesus, two groups of Jews that normally did not get along well. Here we see it as spies. Those that come, they appear to be sincere and honest. And they've got a question. I mean, it was still a question that was being debated at that time among rabbis. And so the question they were asking was legit in essence, but they really didn't want the answer. The question was, what should they give to Caesar? What obligation did they really have to the Roman authorities? And Jesus knows with it, how he answers, he's either going to lose support of the people, or, they know with Jesus' answer that he'll lose support of the people. If he says pay taxes, if he says don't pay taxes, he's going to be seen as an insurrectionist. And, he'll be in trouble with the governor. So, in verse 19, the religious leaders there, they couldn't arrest him, so they didn't give up. And we come to verse 20, and they come sending spies, pretending to be honest. They didn't give up. The word that we have, it says they hope to set a trap. We read they hope to catch Jesus. They hope to catch Jesus. It is truly the image of setting a trap for an animal. So they really hope to put Jesus like an animal into a trap. They hope to place Jesus in this dilemma as they approach him as a mediator. They offer flattery, but they're coming to him as a mediator. They're coming like friends. They're hoping that Jesus will criticize the current taxation policy that's in place. And they pretend to be honest men. The spies, we know that you speak the truth and what is right, and that you do not show partiality. They teach the way of accordance to God and truth. They come flattering Jesus. They come sucking up to Jesus before they ask the question. They're hoping that Jesus has an ego and they can catch Jesus off guard. But it's a loaded question. Again, it's one, like I said, had been debated. Was it lawful to pay Caesar? And if it was it really what God wanted? And as today, people still don't like to pay taxes. But here we had another reason. It was because the taxes were going to a foreign occupier, Rome, which they saw, which it was a pagan government. But they also saw, besides giving money to a pagan government, they were supporting the Roman upper class as well as pagan religions. We've talked about this before. There are basically three types of taxes at the time. There's a land tax, also your real estate tax for today, or a produce tax, which took 1/10 of the grain, 1/5 of all the fruit or wine. There was a head or poll tax that was taken when the census was done, and that was 1 day's wages. And the good news, if you're over 65, you get opted out on that one. But none of you are Jewish, so I guess you don't have to worry. Huh? Yeah, it'd be a miracle during that time period to live to 65. You're right. And then there's a customs tax. And we talked about that one that possibly that Matthew was working to collect, a customs tax, which would be collected at ports and city gates as a toll for goods transported. And this would be 2 to 5% or more of the value of the goods. Like I said, we'll debate what kind of, you go into commentators, they're going to debate all over the place. Well, what type of tax are they questioning? I don't think they really cared. They weren't really going to Jesus for advice on tax law. Yes, we know they hated paying taxes, but that wasn't the intent. They wanted to trap Jesus. So like I said, if Jesus said, pay the taxes, he would have been seen as a traitor of the Jews. He's in cahoots with the Romans. He would be seen as a traitor to the Jews and their nation. But if he said, don't pay taxes, you could see them going to Pilate and saying, hey, he's an insurrectionist. So they are sure. There's no way they can lose this one. They're sure they have the perfect trap. But, verse 24, Jesus sees through their duplicity. He sees through their craftiness and scheming. He knew it was a trick or a trap. You know, he knew they were baiting him. He knew they were sucking up to him. So that's why he asked for a denarius. Show me a denarius, and whose portrait and inscription on it. A denarius, we talked about before, is the common coin, a laborer's daily wage. A laborer's daily wage. It was silver, and it would have had the image of the emperor, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. So with it, they had this question, and Jesus asks, he says, so whose image is on it? And they say Caesar. Well, that was like, give you a quarter, whose image is on it? Nobody uses a quarter, George Washington. I was going to say nobody uses change anymore. Okay. It's George Washington, yeah. That's going to be dated in 10 years. I won't be able to use that, will I? But yes, it's George Washington. They say it's Caesar. Caesar. Easy question. Something even a child can answer. Caesar. Got to think about this again. Caesar, who was not just the leader, he was seen as divine. He was seen as the chief priest. Caesar was worshipped as a god. Caesar was worshipped as God. That alone made another reason why the Jews did not want to pay taxes. So again, plain dumb here. Whose image is on it? Caesar's. Caesar's. And with it, Jesus basically says this. If the coin bears Caesar's image, then it belongs to Caesar. It's like if I have a jacket here and it has my name, then my mom didn't sew it in here. But if it did and it said Jeff Wilson, then it's probably mine, right? So that's why he said, if the coin has Caesar's image on it, must be his. That's what Jesus is saying. Sort of like flipping it. It belongs to Caesar. It's got his picture on it. It must be his. Give it to him. But he doesn't end there. He says, but give to God what is God. Because he said, basically paying taxes does not mean that you're submitting to this divinity. You're not claiming that he's really a God. I mean, technically, Caesar had the right to tax them. They had received benefits. They had this great road system that, was throughout the empire. But what Caesar didn't have is Caesar didn't have a claim to their souls. So for the physical stuff, the benefits, pay to Caesar what's Caesar's. To what you give to the temple, that's God's. That's God's. So give to God what is God, give to Rome what is Rome's. It's the same as today. I mean, it's the image that we live truly in a dual world. And as long as Rome represented the government, he says, give to Rome. But he says, remember this, God has a right for a soul. It'll be saying again to us, you can do both, but you truly have to keep priorities right. You truly have to keep your priorities straight. I see sometimes, even in today's world, we get so messed up on this. So Jesus answered, verse 26, here's what he said. Luke says about Jesus' answer, they were unable to trap him on what he had said there in public. Plus, they're astonished by his answer, Luke says, and they became silent. So Jesus, with the answer Jesus gave, he didn't upset the people. He didn't upset the people of Rome either. And Luke says they are amazed, and they're silenced, and he silenced the questioners. But he doesn't silence all of the questioners. So I'm going to read 27 through 40, and we'll stop and we'll come back to it. All right? I'm going to just at least read it to us. That way we won't have to spend as much time next week. Some of the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to Jesus with a question. So again, another question. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, then a man must marry the widow and have children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The one who married a woman and died childless. The second and the third married her, and in the same way, the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died too. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 had married to her? And Jesus replied, the people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking care in that age and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And they can no longer die, for they are like angels. They're God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But in the account of the bush, even Moses show that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. For to him all are alive. Some of the teachers of the law responded, "Well said, teacher." And no one dared to ask him any more questions. I'm going to just read this little thing from Life Application I gave on a sheet and then we'll stop. The Sadducees. The political party of the Sadducees was mostly made up of the wealthiest and most prominent of Jews. They dominated the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. Under Roman law, the council had received a certain amount of independence and authority. Yet Rome could also take away their property rights and privileged positions if they so desired. So it served in the Sadducees' best interest, therefore, to cooperate with Rome. The Sadducees enjoyed wealth, comfort, and power. And here we go. Here's the thing. Resurrection after the dead was a future dream for the poor masses to hold on to. And so because of this, the Sadducees did not believe in it. But yet we see that Sadducees come asking a question about what happens in the resurrection. Do they really want to know? No. Why do they ask Jesus? Jesus is a threat. They want to trap Jesus, right? He's a trap Jesus. Jesus is a threat. Again, they're wealthy. They're prominent. They don't want to lose their position. And Jesus is a threat to that position. So let's pray our way out. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Delete.